Before the flood, before the armies, before the cities of war, there was one man, the first to bend fire to his will, the first to shape metal into tools, the first to forge weapons that would change the fate of humanity forever. His name was Tubal-Cain. The world was young, but sin was old. Cain's children had abandoned God, turning their backs on the warnings of the righteous. They built great cities, ruled over men, and sought power above all else. And in the heart of this rising empire stood a man whose name would be whispered for generations. Tubal-Cain, the father of metallurgy, the master of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Genesis 4. But this was no simple craftsman. This was a man who held the power to shape history in his hands. With fire and hammer, he did not just create, he armed. He did not just build, he prepared for war. And as his blades gleamed under the sun, the world would never be the same. Before Tubal-Cain, war was primitive. Battles were fought with sticks and stones, crude spears carved from wood. But now, with iron in their hands, men could kill with precision. Armies could rise, kingdoms could fall. The strong could rule aim. Before the floodwaters swallowed the world, humanity was at its peak. Cities rose, music filled the streets, and wealth spread like wildfire among Cain's descendants. Industry, trade, and craftsmanship flourished, but so did violence, greed, and rebellion against God. The children of Cain, banished from Eden's blessing, built their own kingdom, one not ruled by divine righteousness but by power and progress. It was an age of brilliance, an era of corruption. In this time, Tubal-Cain was more than just a man. He was a legend. But who was he, really? Why does the Bible mention him among the few figures in Cain's bloodline? Genesis 4 verse 22 gives us a glimpse into his importance. Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. This single verse hints at a man of immense influence, a pioneer of an age of war and empire. With his knowledge of metal, he armed kings and tyrants, shaping the battlefield with weapons that had never existed before. The iron blade and the bronze spear, the instruments of death, began with him. He was the first weaponsmith, the architect of war, the father of an era where strength ruled and the weak perished. Yet, despite his power, Tubal-Cain and his entire bloodline vanished without a trace. No cities remain bearing his name. No descendants survived the flood that erased Cain's legacy from the face of the earth. How could a man whose knowledge shaped civilization be completely lost to time? What happened to him? Did he fight against Noah's prophecy of the coming flood? Did he attempt to wield his power against God? Or did he simply perish, his great forges drowned beneath the waters of judgment?
The world is changing. Blood cries from the ground once more. Men no longer fear the heavens. They carve their own fate with blades forged in fire. This is the work of Tubal-Cain, and this is not the way of the Lord.
His story is one of innovation and destruction, power and ruin, human brilliance and divine wrath. It is a story that forces us to ask, what happens when mankind's greatest minds are used for violence instead of virtue? What is the fate of those who seek power without wisdom, influence without righteousness? Was Tubal-Cain a villain, or was he simply a man who gave humanity what it wanted? Strength, weapons, and the means to rule.
The old ways are dead. The strong will take what is theirs. Let those who call upon their God hide in the mountains, for the world belongs to those who are willing to fight for it.
The mystery of Tubal-Cain is a mirror reflecting the ambitions of every great civilization. He is the first inventor of war, the father of industry, and a warning of what happens when mankind wields power without restraint. His legacy is carved in every battlefield, echoed in every war, and forged in every weapon that mankind has ever raised. But in the end, his entire lineage was wiped from history, an eerie silence that speaks louder than any war cry. And so we ask, what really happened to Tubal-Cain? Did his creations shape the Nephilim warriors, the mighty men of old? Did he stand against Noah, defying the warning of God? Or did he too perish in the flood, his name becoming nothing more than a haunting reminder of a world that destroyed itself? This is his story. The rise of the first weaponsmith, the kingdom of Cain, the dawn of war, the final reckoning. Stay with me, because what we are about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about the world before the flood. In a time when the earth was still young and humanity had barely taken its first steps outside of Eden, a child was born into a cursed bloodline, one marked by exile, rebellion, and violence. His name would become synonymous with industry and war, a name that would echo through history and myth alike. Tubal-Cain. His origins lay within the lineage of Cain, the first murderer, the man condemned to wander the earth under the weight of divine judgment. But unlike his ancestor, Tubal-Cain would not be known for the sin of fratricide. His legacy would be different. It would be one of innovation, creation, and destruction, the forging of weapons that would forever change the course of human history. Tubal-Cain was born into the house of Lamech, a powerful dynasty within Cain's growing civilization. His grandfather, Lamech, was a man of immense arrogance and brutality, infamous for his unrepentant declaration of vengeance. In Genesis 4:23-24, Lamech boasts to his wives, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times." Unlike Cain, who feared divine punishment, Lamech took pride in his own ruthlessness. He was the first recorded polygamist, breaking the sanctity of marriage as God had designed it. He embodied the worst of humanity's rebellion: violence without remorse, arrogance without restraint, ambition without wisdom. This was the world Tubal-Cain was born into, a world where strength was celebrated above righteousness, where civilization flourished but godlessness reigned. As a descendant of Cain, he was marked by the legacy of exile, forever separated from the line of Seth, who still worshiped the God of their fathers. Cain's descendants, though outcasts, had built a civilization that rivaled anything seen before. They constructed cities, developed music and arts, mastered animal husbandry, and laid the foundation for future industries. But at the core of their achievements lay a rejection of God, an insatiable hunger for power, control, and dominion over the earth. From his earliest days, Tubal-Cain was surrounded by a world that valued dominance over devotion. The Cainites, though prosperous, lived under the shadow of Cain's curse, a curse that had condemned their forefather to a life of wandering, ensuring that their cities would always be temporary, their rule always fragile. Though they built great settlements and established culture, their foundation was built on rebellion. They were architects of civilization, yet spiritually lost. Tubal-Cain, growing up in this world, would embody the very essence of Cain's bloodline: an innovator, a creator, a man who would shape the world through his skills, yet remain bound to a destiny of destruction. But beyond the walls of the cities of Cain, another people existed: the line of Seth. Unlike the Cainites, Seth's descendants preserved the worship of the one true God. While Cain's descendants focused on conquering the earth, Seth's line was devoted to walking with God. The contrast between these two bloodlines could not have been greater. The Sethites sought to preserve righteousness in a world that was rapidly descending into wickedness. The Cainites, on the other hand, became the first great empire of men, expanding their dominion, advancing knowledge, yet moving further and further from the presence of God. The tension between these two worlds, the God-fearing and the godless, the righteous and the rebellious, shaped Tubal-Cain's early life. He would have grown up hearing the stories of Cain's curse, learning how his ancestor had killed Abel in a fit of jealousy and was marked by God for his crime. He would have been told of Lamech's ruthless declaration, the way his grandfather had doubled down on Cain's rebellion, making it clear that the house of Lamech feared no divine punishment. Yet despite these dark origins, Tubal-Cain would not be a brute or a warlord. His path would be different. He would be a maker, a craftsman, a builder of tools and weapons. And through his work, he would shape not just the world of his own time, but the future of human civilization itself. Though Cain's bloodline was cursed, it was not without brilliance. The Cainites, in their defiance of God, sought to create their own security, relying on ingenuity and craftsmanship rather than divine provision. They built homes, farms, instruments, and industries. They thrived through human intelligence, not divine guidance. Tubal-Cain, from a young age, displayed a mind unlike any other. He was fascinated by the earth, by the rocks and ores hidden beneath the soil. While others saw dirt and dust, he saw potential. He saw the power to shape the elements, to create something greater than mere stone tools. He was not content with what existed. He wanted to forge something new, something stronger. It is important to recognize that Tubal-Cain did not operate in isolation. He was part of a lineage that prized progress, that sought to outmatch the limitations placed upon them by a divine decree. Cain's curse had made them wanderers, but through innovation, they built cities. Tubal-Cain's discovery of metallurgy would be the final step in their grand defiance. The creation of weapons that would allow them to conquer, to rule, to enforce their will upon the earth. No longer would the strong dominate merely through physical might. Now, they would wield blades of bronze, shields of iron, tools that could cut deeper than any fist, sharper than any claw. Yet, in the background of Tubal-Cain's rise, a great warning loomed. The world, though filled with industry and progress, was descending into chaos and corruption. Violence was spreading. The sons of God took the daughters of men, and mighty men of renown began to rise. The Cainites, armed with their new weapons, were more powerful than ever. But in the midst of this, a lone prophet from the line of Seth was building something strange. A massive ark. Noah, the last righteous man, stood as a warning against everything the Cainites had built. While they relied on metal and conquest, Noah relied on faith and obedience. The world around him laughed, mocked his warnings of judgment, but he continued to build, trusting in the voice of God. Tubal-Cain, though never mentioned in the confrontation, would have surely known of Noah. He would have heard the rumors of a coming flood, of a God who still spoke to Seth's line. Did he dismiss these warnings as foolish superstition? Did he, like Lamech, believe that might made right, that no judgment would come upon them? His story is one of potential and peril, genius and downfall. A man who could have used his gift to build, but instead armed a world that was spiraling toward its doom. His legacy was not one of faith, but of force. And as his weapons filled the hands of warriors, as his creation spread across the earth, the judgment of God grew closer. Cain's bloodline had built a civilization, but they had also sealed their fate. And in the final days before the flood, the clang of metal against metal would be drowned out by the sound of thunder, the howling of the wind, and the rising of waters that would wash away everything he had ever created. Tubal-Cain had been born into a cursed family, a city of defiance, a world on the brink. His name would be remembered not for his righteousness, but for the tools he forged, the weapons that shaped the rise and fall of the first great empire of man. His story was just beginning, but the flood was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. The earth trembled as the molten rivers of fire flowed down the mountainsides, glowing with an otherworldly heat. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning rock, and the ground beneath cracked and smoldered where the fiery veins of the earth erupted. To most men, such sights were terrifying, a glimpse of divine wrath, a reminder of the great chasm between humanity and the gods. But to Tubal-Cain, it was something else. It was opportunity. It was revelation. Unlike those around him, Tubal-Cain did not see the volcanoes as mere destroyers. He saw them as fountains of power, forces of nature that could be tamed. He watched the strange red liquid that oozed from the earth, glowing in the darkness before hardening into something far more durable than stone. He collected fragments of cooled rock, testing them against the sharpest flint. He struck them, crushed them, and shaped them, realizing that this substance was unlike anything his ancestors had ever wielded. It was the moment that changed human history forever. For generations, men had worked only with stone, wood, and bone, crafting their tools and weapons from the brittle materials they found in nature. The world had long been ruled by simple spears, sharpened sticks hardened in fire, and clubs carved from heavy tree limbs. But stone was fragile. Wood would splinter. Something stronger was needed. Something that would last. And Tubal-Cain, the brilliant mind of Cain's bloodline, was the first to unlock the secret that would forever alter the course of civilization: metal. His first experiments were crude, placing stones in the hottest fires, watching them change color, testing their strength. He realized that certain rocks, when heated, would become soft, even liquid, before cooling into something new, something unbreakable. At first, his peers mocked his obsession. Why play with fire when one could fashion weapons from what nature had already provided? But Tubal-Cain knew better. He saw what others could not, that this was the key to reshaping the world, to dominating it. As he refined his process, his discoveries grew more advanced. He learned how to shape and mold the molten rock, how to extract metals from ores buried deep in the earth, and how to make them stronger. Bronze, then iron, two metals that would become the foundation of kingdoms. With these, he could forge plows to till the land, sickles to harvest crops, and chisels to cut deeper into stone than ever before. But Tubal-Cain was not just a craftsman, he was an architect of power. He understood that the true potential of his discovery was not in tools for farming, but in weapons for conquest. And so, his forges burned day and night, producing swords, axes, and shields, the first of their kind. With these weapons, men could kill with greater ease, defend their homes with greater strength, and expand their empires with greater speed. The impact of these new weapons was immediate and absolute. For the first time, strength alone was not enough to rule. The mightiest warriors, no matter how large or skilled, could be brought down by a single stroke of a well-crafted blade. The balance of power shifted. Armies grew. Kingdoms rose. Tribal leaders, warlords, and kings sought out Tubal-Cain, desperate for the weapons that could give them an advantage over their rivals. With each passing year, Tubal-Cain's influence grew. His name was whispered in the courts of kings, his skills desired by rulers who longed to cement their power. No longer was he just the grandson of Lamech. He was now the most powerful man in Cain's city. His knowledge made him indispensable. His weapons made him feared. His forge became the heart of civilization itself. As his power expanded, so did the scale of warfare. Battles that had once been fought with spears and slings now echoed with the clash of bronze blades and the ringing of iron against iron. Shields reinforced with metal allowed warriors to withstand blows that would have once been fatal. Warriors who wielded Tubal-Cain's weapons became legends, unstoppable forces on the battlefield. But while Cain's city thrived on war, something dark was rising in the world. Violence had become not just a means of survival, but a way of life. Blood flowed in the streets. Kings no longer sought wisdom. They sought power. The land groaned under the weight of conquest, and those who had once tilled the soil now lived by the sword. Meanwhile, in the distance, the line of Seth remained separate. They saw what was happening in the cities of Cain and lamented the rise of bloodshed. Their prophets warned of judgment, but Cain's descendants did not listen. Why should they? They had power. They had weapons. They had Tubal-Cain. And so as the fires of his forge burned brighter, so did the corruption of the world. His name became synonymous with strength, with warfare, with conquest. He had changed humanity forever. But what he could not see, what no one in Cain's city could see, was that their end was coming. For far away, in a quiet place untouched by war, Noah was building something. Something that would erase everything Tubal-Cain had built. The world before Tubal-Cain's rise was raw and primal. Men fought to survive, using whatever nature provided, sharpened sticks, crude stone axes, and slings. Warfare was chaotic, desperate, and ruled by brute strength. The strong crushed the weak with their bare hands, battles were fought in wild frenzies, and victory belonged to those with the most endurance. It was a world where might was measured by muscle, not by technology. In those days, warriors fought as beasts, tackling, clawing, and bashing each other with rocks until one side could fight no more. But all of that was about to change. Tubal-Cain was about to usher in a new world, one where war would no longer be determined by physical power alone, but by the weapons men carried. The moment he harnessed the power of metal, the balance of warfare shifted forever. Stone and wood would no longer define battle. Bronze and iron would. And with that shift came an era of conquest, power, and bloodshed unlike anything the world had ever seen. At first, Tubal-Cain's discovery was a mere curiosity. He learned that certain rocks, when heated in fire, melted into something malleable, something stronger. He experimented, testing different methods to purify and shape the raw metal, hammering, bending, and sharpening it into different forms. What began as a tool for farming and construction soon became something else entirely. Tubal-Cain had no interest in simple plows or chisels. He saw something much greater. He envisioned a future where the strongest warriors wielded weapons of steel, where kings commanded armies clad in metal, where battles were no longer determined by who had the most men, but by who had the sharpest blades. This vision was no mere fantasy. His weapons proved far superior to anything that had existed before. Wooden clubs shattered on impact, stone knives dulled after only a few uses, but bronze and iron, they endured. A sword crafted by Tubal-Cain could cleave through flesh with ease. A spear tipped with his metal could pierce even the thickest hide. Shields reinforced with bronze could withstand even the heaviest blow. The age of stone was over. The age of metal had begun. It did not take long for the warlords and rulers of Cain's cities to take notice. They saw in Tubal-Cain's weapons something they had never possessed before, an undeniable advantage. No longer would battles be left to chance or to the simple strength of men. Now, battles would be decided by the weapons they carried. A single well-armed soldier was now worth 10 unarmed men, and the rulers of the world were eager to control the man who could provide these weapons. Tubal-Cain's reputation grew. He became more than just a blacksmith. He became the most influential figure in Cain's civilization. Kings sought his favor, offering him wealth and power in exchange for the weapons that would give them an edge over their enemies. His forges never cooled, his workshops filled with the sound of clashing metal and roaring flames. He supplied blades, spears, and armor to those who could afford them, and in doing so, he reshaped the very nature of war. What had once been small skirmishes between tribes and clans soon evolved into full-scale wars. With Tubal-Cain's weapons, rulers no longer defended their lands, they expanded them. They sent their armies out to conquer, to raid, to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The weak were no longer merely oppressed, they were erased. The age of mercy was over. This was the age of conquest. The cities of Cain, once thriving centers of culture and trade, became fortresses ruled by warlords who only knew power. Every settlement had to defend itself, fortify its walls, arm its people. No longer was survival dependent on farming or trade. It was dependent on who had the best weapons, the strongest warriors, the most ruthless leaders. And at the center of it all stood Tubal-Cain, the father of war. Yet, despite his growing influence, Tubal-Cain was not a warrior himself. He never marched into battle, never wielded a sword in combat. But he did not have to. His work was far more powerful than any single warrior. The swords he forged became the instruments of kings. The weapons he crafted decided the fate of entire nations. But as his weapons spread, so did something darker, a philosophy, a way of thinking that would define this era of history. It was a simple belief, one that would shape the world for generations. Might makes right. It was no longer about justice, wisdom, or righteousness. The strong would rule, and the weak would perish. Tubal-Cain's weapons became the great equalizer, ensuring that no man could rely on divine favor alone. Only those who fought, those who wielded the sword, would survive. His legacy was no longer just about metal, it was about power. This shift in thinking was not just a byproduct of war, it was the new law of the land. The kings and rulers who once feared the gods now feared only one thing: defeat. There was no longer a sense of divine order, no sacred authority. The sword was now the highest power. If you wanted land, you took it. If you wanted wealth, you stole it. If you wanted a throne, you killed for it. No more appeals to justice. Only the sharpness of your blade determined who would rule. The world that Tubal-Cain had helped create was one of endless conflict. Every man an enemy, every city a battlefield, every ruler a tyrant. Violence spread like a disease, consuming everything in its path. The stronger nations devoured the weaker ones, and even the victors knew that one day they too would be conquered. There was no peace, no stability, only war. Yet in the midst of this destruction there remained one last beacon of hope: the descendants of Seth. While Cain's civilization thrived on conquest and warfare, Seth's lineage continued to walk with God. They did not seek war, nor did they rely on Tubal-Cain's weapons. They lived in the wilderness, in the high places, away from the corruption that spread through the cities of Cain. But they saw what was happening. They saw the rise of bloodshed, the spreading violence, the way the world was being consumed by war. They knew that something terrible was coming. And they were right. Far away in a land untouched by war, one man was preparing for something greater than any battle, greater than any warlord's ambition. While Tubal-Cain's forges burned with fire, Noah was building something else, a wooden structure that no man had seen before. The kings of Cain laughed at the idea of divine judgment. They had weapons, they had warriors, they had power. What flood could destroy them? What storm could wipe away their armies? But Tubal-Cain's greatest weapons would prove useless against what was coming. No sword could cut through the waves. No shield could protect against the wrath of God. And as the floodwaters began to rise, Tubal-Cain's kingdom, his legacy, and everything he had built would be swallowed whole. He had changed the world, yes, but the world was about to be wiped clean. Would the weapons of man survive? Would his knowledge persist beyond the flood? Or would history forget him, just as it forgot the world he had helped create? The storm was coming, and no blade, no armor, no war machine could stand against it. Tubal-Cain had forged the greatest weapons the world had ever seen. But the judgment of God would be greater. The world before the flood was not a barren wasteland of scattered nomads. It was a world of cities, kingdoms, and civilizations, one divided into two opposing factions. On one side stood the descendants of Seth, worshippers of God, who lived apart from the corruption of Cain's bloodline. On the other stood the kingdom of Cain, built on conquest, power, and self-sufficiency, where strength dictated rule and war was a way of life. These two civilizations, though both born from Adam's children, could not have been more different. The Sethites followed the path of righteousness, passing down the knowledge of God from father to son, keeping the faith of their ancestor Enosh, who had first led people to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. They lived in the hills, in regions far from Cain's great cities, avoiding their violent ways. They worshipped in purity, rejecting the growing corruption of the world. In contrast, the Cainites built a civilization of industry, wealth, and war, but they had cast aside God, following only their own desires. Cain's exile had birthed a legacy of rebellion, a culture that did not seek divine favor, but power through human strength. For centuries, the two lines lived separately, their differences too vast to reconcile. But as the world grew, the gap between them began to close. Cain's cities expanded, and soon, his civilization brushed against the borders of Seth's settlements. At first, the interaction was minimal. The Sethites farmed, tended to their flocks, and lived simple lives in the sight of God. The Cainites, meanwhile, spread their knowledge of metal, industry, and war, building greater and greater kingdoms. They were strong, but they were restless, always hungry for more land, more riches, more dominance. The peace did not last. As Cain's kingdom grew, violence spread like wildfire. At first, it was small raids. Bands of warriors pillaging farmlands, stealing livestock, claiming new lands for themselves. But it did not stop. The warlords of Cain, armed with the weapons of Tubal-Cain, saw no need for diplomacy. They took what they wanted, burning villages, killing men, and seizing women and children as slaves. For the first time, war had reached the righteous. Seth's descendants, who had once been separate, were now forced to defend themselves against an enemy far more powerful than they had ever faced. They had no forges, no warriors trained in battle, no weapons like the swords and axes of Cain's people. They relied on their faith, but against sharpened steel, faith alone seemed not enough. And Tubal-Cain, he stood at the center of it all. Though he had no stake in these wars personally, his creations had given Cain's kingdom the power to dominate the world. His weapons filled the hands of raiders, kings, and warlords. He was the architect of conquest, even if he never lifted a sword himself. He had turned men into gods of war, into beings of unmatched destruction. But there were whispers that Tubal-Cain had armed more than just men. Legends speak of mighty warriors, beings of unnatural strength, towering over ordinary men. The Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 describes them as the mighty men of old, men of renown. They were said to be the offspring of fallen angels and human women, and their strength was unmatched. The Bible does not say whether Tubal-Cain had any direct connection to them, but it is not hard to imagine that if they existed in his time, they too would have sought his weapons. What would happen when a being already blessed with unnatural power was given the finest weaponry in history. What devastation would follow when the Nephilim, giants of war, were armed with iron and bronze? If Cain's people could conquer entire cities with Tubal-Cain's weapons, what could such warriors do with his blades in their hands? If the Nephilim were the champions of Cain's civilization, then Tubal-Cain was their blacksmith. And yet, not all men were blind to the destruction. Far from the cities of Cain, prophets rose among the Sethites, speaking of a great coming judgment. They warned that the violence and corruption spreading across the earth would not go unpunished. The world had become wicked beyond measure, but the patience of God would not last forever. They spoke of a flood, a cleansing, a day when the wickedness of man would be washed away. But who would listen? Cain's people laughed at the warnings. What flood could destroy them? They had fortresses of stone, weapons of iron, cities of wealth. They had warriors who could crush entire nations. They were stronger than any people who had ever lived. The idea that water, mere water, could undo all they had built? It was madness. And so they did what they always did. They took up their weapons, they sharpened their blades, and they continued their wars. They mocked the prophets, ridiculed the righteous, and carried on as if nothing could touch them. But the sky was darkening. A man named Noah was building something massive, something strange. A vessel, a warning, an ark, and soon the first raindrop would fall. The warnings from the prophets of Seth's line continued, but Cain's civilization remained deaf to them. The world had never seen judgment before. How could they believe in something they had never experienced? For generations, their cities had grown, their armies had conquered, and their weapons had made them invincible. They ruled by strength, by the blade, by the philosophy of might. What was there to fear? Yet, the corruption spread deeper than even the kings and warlords of Cain could have imagined. The merging of the two bloodlines, the righteous and the wicked, accelerated the decay of morality. The sons of God, perhaps Seth's descendants or fallen angels, took daughters from among Cain's people, and their offspring became something unnatural. The Nephilim, mighty warriors of old, became the ultimate enforcers of Cain's reign. If a single warrior wielding an iron blade could slay 10 men, what could a giant with an iron battle axe accomplish? Perhaps Tubal-Cain himself forged weapons for them. It is not hard to imagine warlords bringing these warriors, these men of renown, to his forges, demanding blades worthy of their strength. Perhaps the greatest weapons of his time were not made for mere men, but for beings of unnatural size and power. The clash between Seth and Cain's civilizations was no longer just one of ideologies. It was becoming a battle for survival. But Seth's people had no interest in war. They did not seek conquest, nor did they desire the weapons of Cain. They lived by faith, by worship, by a simple obedience to the God of their fathers. They did not raise armies, nor did they fight back when raiders came upon them. They suffered under the hand of Cain's civilization, but they refused to turn to violence to defend themselves. They clung to righteousness, believing that justice would come, not by the sword, but by the hand of God himself. And justice was coming. One man stood apart from the wickedness of his generation: Noah. While the world around him descended into violence and depravity, Noah walked with God. Genesis 6:9. He saw the darkness spreading, the wars, the unchecked violence, and he heard the voice of the Lord declare, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." Genesis 6:7. The Cainites continued to war among themselves, blind to the storm that was about to consume them. They continued to forge weapons, to sharpen swords, to reinforce their fortresses of stone, believing that their strength would protect them. But Noah had been given a different command: build an ark. The people of Cain laughed. What was this old man doing? Constructing a massive wooden structure in the middle of dry land? Preparing for a flood in a world that had never seen such a thing? Noah's warnings were mocked as the ravings of a madman. The warriors of Cain, their weapons gleaming in the sun, scoffed at the idea that anything could challenge their rule. Even Tubal-Cain, for all his knowledge, could not fathom a world where water could undo the might of iron. What storm could wash away the weapons he had created? What force of nature could erase the civilization that he had helped arm? His legacy was secure, or so he believed. But the heavens would soon open. The first drop of rain would fall, and when it did, not a single blade of iron, not a single sword of bronze, not a single warrior, no matter how mighty, would be able to stand against the judgment of God. Cain's kingdom had believed in strength, but no man could fight the flood. No weapon could stop the waters. No army could conquer the wrath of heaven. And so, as the rain began to fall, Tubal-Cain's forges went silent. The clash of metal against metal ceased. The war cries of warriors became screams of terror. Cities that had been built upon conquest were now submerged beneath the rising waters. And just like that, the civilization that had once ruled the world was gone. The mighty men of renown, the warriors who had dominated the land, the kings who had wielded Tubal-Cain's weapons, all were wiped from history. Only Noah and his family remained. Only those who had listened. Only those who had walked with God. And as the ark floated above the drowned world, the knowledge of Tubal-Cain, the weapons, the forges, the philosophy of might, sank beneath the waves, lost forever to time. Would his name be remembered? Or would he, too, be forgotten, like the world he had helped shape? The flood had come, and the age of Cain was over. The world of Tubal-Cain was on the brink of catastrophe, but few could see it coming. The days of Noah were marked by an unparalleled level of violence, corruption, and moral decay. Genesis 6:11. The world had once been a place of innovation and civilization, a place where men built cities, ruled over nations, and established a form of society driven by conquest and strength. But at its core, the world had become a battlefield, ruled not by wisdom or righteousness, but by bloodshed and brute force. The weapons that Tubal-Cain had forged, the swords, the axes, the spears of bronze and iron, were everywhere. In the cities of Cain, the clang of metal against metal echoed in the streets as warlords trained their armies. Raiders and conquerors, once limited by the fragility of wooden clubs and stone blades, now marched with weapons that cut deeper, shields that could withstand the heaviest of blows. The philosophy of strength had fully consumed mankind. There was no longer any law but the sword. Every king feared the ruler with a stronger army. Every army feared the warlord with the better weapons. And every warrior feared the day he would meet someone with a sharper blade. It was an endless cycle of bloodshed, one that could never be satisfied. Yet even as men fought for power, they were blind to the true danger approaching. The greatest threat to their civilization was not another warlord, not a rival kingdom, but something far greater. Something they could not fight, could not wound, could not conquer. The judgment of God was coming. In the midst of this chaos, one man did not take up arms. One man did not prepare for war. One man was building something far greater than any weapon, any fortress, any city of Cain. That man was Noah. While Tubal-Cain's forges burned hot, Noah labored in obedience. While kings sharpened their swords, Noah shaped the beams of a massive wooden structure. While warriors trained for battle, Noah prepared for a flood that no one believed was coming. The contrast between these two men could not have been greater. One was arming the world for war, the other was preparing for salvation. Noah's task was seen as an absurdity by the people of Cain. A flood? A deluge that would cover the entire earth? The idea was laughable. For generations, there had been no such thing. How could water, something so simple, so weak, destroy the might of kings and warriors? No fortress had ever fallen to rain. No battle had ever been lost to the rivers. The greatest warlords of Cain's kingdom had never met a force they could not conquer. Why should they fear a flood? Tubal-Cain, like many of his generation, likely dismissed Noah's warnings. A man who had built empires with his craft, who had supplied warriors with the tools to dominate the world, could not imagine a future where all of it would be washed away. His weapons had decided the fate of nations. Surely, no force on earth could challenge the might he had helped create. But the warnings continued. Noah's message was clear. The corruption of mankind had reached its limit. The bloodshed, the violence, the sin, it could not go on. God had declared the end of all flesh, for the earth was filled with violence because of them. Genesis 6:13. Still the people laughed. Still they prepared for war. Still Tubal-Cain's forges burned. But then the sky changed. The sun that had shone over Cain's cities for centuries grew dark with storm clouds that no one had ever seen before. The air was thick, heavy, filled with an unnatural stillness. Something was coming. Something no sword, no spear, no warrior could stop. And then the first drop of rain fell. At first, it was insignificant, a few scattered droplets on the hardened streets of Cain's cities. The warlords ignored it. The warriors continued their training. The kings planned their next conquests. No one paid attention until the wind began to howl, until the skies erupted with torrents of water, the likes of which no man had ever witnessed, until the earth itself began to break apart as fountains from the deep exploded upward, sending water surging through the land. Genesis 7:11. It was too late. The warlords who had marched with weapons of bronze and iron now ran in terror, their swords useless against the rising floodwaters. The mighty kings, the warriors who had ruled by force, scrambled for high ground, desperately trying to escape the inescapable. Tubal-Cain's forges, once filled with fire and smoke, were drowned beneath waves that consumed his entire civilization. The greatest weapons ever crafted, the instruments of conquest, were lost beneath the deep. And for the first time since the beginning of his reign, death came for Tubal-Cain. The man who had armed the world, the father of the warrior age, could not forge a weapon against the wrath of God. The flood had come, and the age of Cain was no more. The floodwaters surged like an army greater than any Tubal-Cain had ever armed. What had once been mighty kingdoms, filled with war cries and the clash of iron, were now reduced to chaos and panic. The people who had spent their lives preparing for battle had no weapons against the wrath that was unfolding before them. Their swords, their spears, their armor, all of it was meaningless now. The streets of Cain's cities, once bustling with traders, warriors, and rulers, became rivers swallowing everything in their path. The bronze and iron gates that had once protected kings from invaders were no match for the force of the waters tearing through them. The forges of Tubal-Cain, which had burned hotter than the sun, were now drowning, their fires extinguished, their creations carried away by the endless waves. Men who had relied on strength tried to fight the flood, but what could they do? They climbed onto rooftops, clinging to the highest points of their once great civilization. They screamed for help, but there was no army to come to their aid, no ally to protect them, no fortress to keep them safe. Where was Tubal-Cain in all of this? Did he stand defiantly in his forge, refusing to believe that this was the end? Did he look at the rising waters and attempt to build a final weapon, something to hold back the judgment of God? Did he try to forge a new tool, a way to escape? Or did he finally understand in those last moments that all his power had been nothing more than an illusion? The storm raged on. Perhaps he tried to flee, running through the streets of a city being swallowed whole. Perhaps he climbed the tallest structure he could find, watching as everything he had ever built disappeared beneath the waters. Perhaps, for the first time in his life, he felt fear. The flood did not show favoritism. It did not care that he had built the strongest weapons in the world. It did not care that he had been the greatest smith of his time. The judgment was absolute. And as the waves rose, as the screams of kings and warriors were silenced one by one, Tubal-Cain's name was erased from the land of the living. The waters did not recede for over a year. When they finally did, Cain's civilization was gone. No trace of its mighty cities remained. No monument stood to remind the world of its greatness. No weapons, no forges, no thrones survived. The world had been washed clean, and Tubal-Cain's legacy sank beneath the mud and silt of a world reborn. The flood was not just the destruction of a civilization, it was the burial of an era, an entire way of life. No longer would men look to Cain's lineage for wisdom, for leadership, for power. Their names were lost, their history wiped away. But was Tubal-Cain truly gone? Though his body perished, his influence would never fully disappear. The knowledge he had unlocked, the art of forging metal, the craft of weaponry, would rise again. After the flood, mankind would rediscover his secrets. The descendants of Noah would one day hold swords once more, build fortresses once more, and wage wars once more. Tubal-Cain may have died in the flood, but his influence lived on in the ambitions of men. The cycle of war and conquest would return, and once again, mankind would forget the lessons of the flood. But no matter how powerful the weapons became, no matter how great the kingdoms of men would rise, they would all meet the same fate. Because the flood was not the last judgment. One day the world will face a final judgment. Not by water, but by fire. And on that day, just like in the days of Noah, no weapon will be able to stand against the wrath of God. The world of Tubal-Cain had drowned, but his story is a warning for us all. No kingdom, no invention, no weapon can stand against the hand of the Almighty. The story of Tubal-Cain is more than just a forgotten chapter in the early history of humanity. It is a lesson, a warning, and a reflection of the choices that define civilizations. He was a man of unmatched skill, the first to harness the power of fire and metal, the father of weaponry and industry. But his legacy was not one of peace or prosperity. It was one of bloodshed and war. He gave men the tools to dominate, to conquer, to enforce their will upon others. Yet, in the end, neither his brilliance nor his weapons could save him. When the flood came, all his creations were washed away, his name erased from history, his empire buried beneath the waters. Tubal-Cain represents something that has repeated itself throughout human history: the pursuit of power without the restraint of righteousness. The knowledge he unlocked was not inherently evil. Metalworking and craftsmanship were gifts of intelligence and innovation. But the way that knowledge was used, to build weapons, to fuel conquest, to spread violence, led to his civilization's downfall. Technology without morality leads to destruction. This pattern has echoed through the ages. Every great civilization that has placed power over principles, force over faith, conquest over compassion, has eventually collapsed. The cities of Cain, mighty as they were, could not stand against divine judgment, and the same will be true for every society that follows the same path. The flood did more than destroy a world. It ended a lineage. Cain's bloodline, marked by rebellion and violence, was wiped from the earth. The kingdom he built, the warriors he armed, the forges he established, all gone. His name lived on only as a cautionary tale, a shadow of what happens when man builds without God. And yet, the lessons were forgotten. Though Noah's descendants were given a fresh start, it wasn't long before mankind returned to the same old path. Weapons were rediscovered. Armies rose again. Kings built empires. By the time of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, humanity was once again trying to assert its dominance, to rise above its place, to become its own god. The same mistakes, the same arrogance, the same corruption, history repeated itself. And today, are we any different? Look at the world we live in now. We have built more than Tubal-Cain could have ever imagined. We have harnessed energy beyond fire, metals stronger than iron, weapons far more powerful than swords. Technology has advanced beyond anything ancient civilizations could comprehend. And yet, what do we use it for? Do we use it to create peace, to heal, to restore? Or have we, like the generations before us, turned innovation into a tool of destruction? We have weapons that can erase entire nations in an instant. We build fortresses of steel, armies of machines, defenses that no ancient king could have dreamed of. Yet, the heart of man remains unchanged. Power still corrupts, violence still spreads, greed still rules. Tubal-Cain's legacy lives on, not in name, but in practice. The world has embraced his philosophy of strength, of dominance, of conquest. But if history has shown us anything, it is that no kingdom built on these things will last. Cain's empire fell, Babylon fell, Rome fell, and one day every empire that follows their path will fall as well. The question is, what side will you stand on? Tubal-Cain created weapons for war, but only God offers true salvation. No weapon can save a man from judgment. No blade can cut through the wrath of God. Tubal-Cain created tools for power, but his creations perished with him. He built for the present, but he did not prepare for eternity. That is the choice we all must face. Will we follow the path of Tubal-Cain, building for the world, seeking power, relying on strength? Or will we follow the path of Noah, walking with God, preparing for salvation, building something that will last beyond this life? The world today, like the world before the flood, is heading toward judgment. And when it comes, no technology, no weapon, no empire will stand. The only refuge is in God. The only salvation is in Jesus Christ. And so as we reflect on this story, let us turn our hearts toward Him. Now let's take a moment to pray together. Wherever you are, close your eyes and repeat these words after me. Heavenly Father, I come before you today, humbled by the lessons of the past. Forgive me for the times I have relied on my own strength instead of yours. Help me to walk in righteousness, to seek wisdom, and to build my life on your truth. Guard my heart from the corruption of this world, and lead me on the path of salvation. I put my trust in you, Lord, knowing that only you can save. In Jesus' name, amen. If this story opened your eyes, like this video, comment below. What lessons can we learn from Tubal-Cain's rise and fall? Subscribe for more biblical deep dives. Don't miss the next revelation. Thank you for staying with us until the end. May God bless you, and may you walk in the light of His truth.